Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar. This morning we have a presentation on pasture, productivity pays in pasture, mastering spring pasture conversion. So just a couple of quick housekeeping things. The webinar will be an hour long. We'll have about a 45-minute presentation, and then there will be time for questions at the end. There's a chat function on the Teams webinar. Please make use of that and put any of the questions that you might have into the chat, and I will pick them up through the Q&A. So without further ado, can I introduce to you Lee Menhenett, our technical agronomist based in Victoria, who is going to present this morning's webinar on pasture. Lee, over to you.
Thanks, Jan, and welcome everybody for this webinar this morning. I guess the crux of this morning is to try to provide some timely information, I suppose, and some thoughts around planning for this spring season, and also just with a bit of a view forward as well. But with a primary objective, I suppose, to really nail the execution of the nutrient applications for this spring period to maximise productivity. So I'll kick off and we'll run through, and by all means, at the end of the presentation, if you've got any queries or discussions, then we'll take them then. So I guess just to start the ball rolling, I did ask some industry experts and some people associated with the industry what their imperatives would be if you had to just nail it down to a concise point or two, what they would be with respect to maximising their spring pasture forage dry matter accumulation. So when I spoke to Malcolm McCaskill, his top point was Olsen P, so targeting those Olsen P levels greater than 15 to maximise your nitrogen response, and we'll talk a fair bit about nitrogen in this presentation. Dean Leslie, who's in the Golden Valley of Victoria, and he's associated with farming, but also is a silage contractor. And what he sees when he goes into paddocks to chop them is that it's not just a one thing that makes the maximum dry matter accumulation on a farm, or the number of cuts that you get off a particular paddock. It's a combination of everything, and the big thing around that is timeliness, planning, and attention to detail. And again, we'll touch on that those parts this morning. Cameron Goulet, his comments were, unlike P&K, storage of nitrogen inputs is limited. So you can't stack nitrogen away. So if you don't use it and you don't use it properly, then you're going to lose it. And Frank Mickham, from a quality perspective, and we'll just finish off the webinar with this point, is always aim for high quality silage. It's better to have quality over quantity, and the imperative have gone to all the effort of making the silage. Make sure your stacks or your bales are well sealed, not just covered. So just a couple of points to set the scene, I suppose, on what the thinking of some industry people are. I don't want to dwell on this, but I just want to point out a couple of things because it does set our thoughts about what's going to happen in the future. So I've just put the graph there on the left, or the map out there on the left is as a map of Australia, and it looks at the moisture deficits over the last 24 months. And we can see extended periods of dry conditions have contributed to really large deficits, and it's not it's no surprise to anybody to see that map. But those moisture deficits have obviously led to pasture deficits, and that's one of the imperatives, I suppose, of getting this spring right, is the fact that we've got empty hay sheds and we need to refill them. On the flip side, when we look forward, the map on the right-hand side is a chance of exceeding median rainfall that the BOM has recently put out, and this is from September to November. And again, we're seeing a lot of green and some darker areas of green, which means the chance of exceeding median rainfall is actually quite good. Some would argue that we haven't seen that occurring at this stage. And to the point I've put on that slide is that it's no certainty that this is going to happen. And so planning and being proactive and making sure we're on the front foot is really important, because if we don't get the rains, or the rains come too late, then we've potentially missed opportunities to grow grass. So we'll cover off some of those points as we go through. So to wrap that up into a little bit more of a concise package, I guess, the dry season this year, so it's been compounded by successive dry years. We had a late break this year as well, which has really put us on the back foot as far as setting up pastures and growing the feed over winter and into early spring. And the issue around that has been that grazing management has likely been suboptimal, let alone the fact that we've probably put our plants under a degree of stress from either overgrazing or the late start. So the ability for the plants to tiller, to get the density, to put their root reserves, their energy reserves into the stem and into their roots has probably been limited because of those points. And it goes to the point on the right-hand side there, those two pictures, where if you have a look at the ryegrass, the perennial ryegrass on the left-hand side, that's been rotationally grazed, it's been spelled, it's been grazed to its leaf emergence over the winter period. It's set up, and from a regrowth from an 8-week grazing rotation, you're getting good regrowth. You've got good root system, compared to the ryegrass plant on the right, where it's obviously been hammered over the winter. The sward is weak. You've got more weeds coming into that sward, and the post-grazing recovery is going to be compromised. And so we need to think a little bit about that, I suppose, when we're thinking about the pastures we're trying to grow grass off in the spring and conserve fodder off, as to whether we've set them up correctly and what we expect as far as dry matter coming off those sites. And the grazing management, as we know, is dictated to not only above the ground but below the ground. And so the root systems of those plants, where it's grazed at one leaf every time, so continually grazed, compared to letting the reserves being built up, they're quite significant differences there. The other thing we need to consider, and things have changed a little bit this year compared to other years, in the fact that we've imported a hell of a lot more feed on farms as well. And that has been either produced on farm or purchased from outside, and so there is a degree of nutrients that have been purchased and brought into farm. How localized within the farm that has been fed out, or broadly across the farm has fed out, will also play into the nutrient status, both for the spring period but also looking forward. So we need to sort of think about that a little bit. We've got empty fodder reserves, we know that, and so therefore we need to maximise our spring production. And I guess the bottom graph there is just talking about the animal demand, which is the solid line, the black line, over the 12-month period. So obviously, if in a spring calving herd or spring lambing, you've got a huge demand in spring. But we also grow this excessive amount of pasture, so we've got this pasture surplus. So what we're trying to do, and what this webinar is about, is trying to capture that surplus so that we've got it to feed out where we've got those pasture deficits at other times of the year. And when we keep that in mind, we just want to then say, okay, well, how are we going to do that? We're going to use fertiliser as a tool to maximise that dry matter production so that we can get that fodder conserved. But there's considerations we need to make around that. Things like moisture status, and we've spoken about the BOM, whether the accuracy there is or not. Fertility status of the soil, pasture status. So we've spoken about that already on the right-hand side there. And also the dry matter utilisation. So these are all the things, I suppose, that we're trying to nail together in this webinar to maximise our fertiliser spend. So just some considerations there. So I think we need to look at the short term and also a medium term. So in the short term, we're definitely looking at this boosting maximum production for this spring period, and also summer crop planting, because it's fodder crop planting, because it's going to be a key form of feed that we're going to have to get our head around as well for filling some feed gaps over the summer period. But we also need to think medium term. So it's not just about this spring period. We've got to be thinking about the summer and the autumn and next season as well. So we need to have a bit longer mindset. And the reason we need to have a bit more of longer term or medium term outlook is that the fundamentals on farm have significantly changed based on the dry conditions of the last 2 years, what we've seen across southern pasture markets. Stocking rates have typically been on the back end, and we've brought in a lot of feed. So the actual removal of nutrients and the nutrient movement within the farm has changed based on those 2 points. So our strategies that we've employed previously around nutrients and fertilizers are potentially changed a little bit. So we need to think about that, and we need to really use an intensive spring property sampling plan to get a good handle of where we are, so that we can make sure that we're maximising our fertiliser spend, maximising the outcome of our fertiliser spend in the next few months. And this time of year, from a sampling perspective, is really good, because you can avoid any atypical areas, you can avoid dug and urine patches, so you can get a really good sample, soil sample and leaf tissue sample, by avoiding those areas, because they're quite pronounced at this time of year. So I suppose the point here is it's a great opportunity to reset, to re-look at things, and go into with a really intensive sampling program. So from a soil testing perspective, best for macronutrients, and also just to understand the underlying soil constraints. So, it's not going to be a huge benefit potentially for this spring sampling period, but it's definitely going to play a role for your summer fodder crops, and also your autumn pasture products, and also the rates that are going to be required, and then also any ameliorants that may be needed. And it's really, the value around it is identifying those critical nutrient ranges. And the biggest thing is, I suppose, using this data to monitor levels over time. And we don't actually look at specific numbers when we're looking at soil tests in isolation. We want to look at ranges, critical ranges, and we want to monitor that over time and look at the trends over time, as whether we're maintaining those levels, whether we're lifting them, or whether we're mining them. And that's where the real power of soil testing on a strategic and well-planned basis comes through. And by doing that, it really means that the value of the nutrients, which I've just put in on the right-hand side, which are in probably the top 10 percentile of costs, fertiliser costs at the moment, we've got to make sure that the cost of those nutrients, when they're put on farm, are actually making a return. So not a cost of the business, but actually a return on that investment that you've made. So really important to get the planning underway, and to get the soil testing program set up and implemented. And then tissue testing at this time of year also is a really great opportunity to number one, refine the base fertiliser strategy. So we set our base fertiliser strategies in place from soil testing. We can then refine it with tissue testing. How is the plant going? What status is it? Do we need to look at upping or downing potentially phosphorus or potassium levels? It gives us a really good handle on the on what the plant's actually how it's performing against our strategies that we're employing. And it's really good for diagnosing trace elements. And from lab data, we can see that there's a large percentage of deficient and low nutrients, micronutrients, that are coming through the lab from pasture samples. So the issues are out there, and in a lot of cases they're hidden, and we don't realise that they're actually costing us production. So again, refining strategies with our fertiliser based on leaf tissue samples, but really nailing down some of these issues with trace elements through grabbing those tissue samples, and then using that information to rectify that with our spring purchases of fertiliser. Just a couple of things on the tissue sampling though. Just make sure you get the correct plant part and the correct growth stage for each plant species. So it's really important to tick those boxes so that you have the critical values for the pasture species. So nutrient removal is going to be a big thing, obviously, when we take fodder from paddocks. And while there are some industry numbers around fodder nutrient removal, there is some variation in that nutrient concentration based on different hays or silages, and also the types of hay and silage that you might get come off paddock. So whether it's grass, clover, or a combination of both, or lucerne. And that is, concentrations can vary based on background nutrient supply from the soil, the time of year that the plants are growing, so it's very seasonal, and also the growth stage. You'll have different nutrient concentrations within plants at different growth stages as you go through. And then the other thing that will vary those nutrient concentrations will be yield. So you tend to get a dilution of nutrients when you get a higher yield. And so a good way to have a look at that is actually grab a silage sample or a hay sample as it's been about to be put into the silage wagon or wrapped up or baled up, and just send it off to the lab. And you can get some really good information and look at the variability and really nail down these budgets of nutrients that are coming off farm. So this is just a couple of samples that come off a couple of different paddocks in the Goulburn Valley from the same farmer. And this is grass clover silage. And so there's two paddocks. There's this Balch Road and Kyoto Road. One yielded 3.7 tonne of dry matter, and the other one yielded 5 tonne. But I've just outlined here, this is kilograms as far as major nutrients and grams as far as minor nutrients that have been removed in that dry matter, and then multiplied out by the yield, how many kilograms or grams have been removed per hectare. So you can see that there is definitely some variability in those nutrients. And then when you multiply it out by the yield, you can see that there are some similarities as far as nutrient removal, but there's also some variability, some variances that are coming through as far as how much NPK, S plus traces come off those different paddocks. So it's a good opportunity to really nail down just some of those removal numbers so that those budgets on farm can be closed. So the logic, I guess, we need to consider for this spring production period is, number one, is a grazing versus fodder conservation. So obviously grazing, your removal levels are going to be a lot less compared to fodder conservation. So that's the first thing, and that's going to change our nutrient supply and nutrient requirements based on that. The nutrient demand, so can the soil reserves meet the plant growth demand? And that's going to be around our critical values, but also understanding the plant accumulation of those nutrients and how quickly they do accumulate at any period of time. So it may need to be supplemented. We're also looking at nutrient removal. So we just spoke about those silage cuts in the Goulburn Valley, but we got to look when we're removing those nutrients either from grazing or from silage hay production. Are we looking at putting those nutrients prior to lockup, or are we looking at putting them post lockup? So there's a couple of nuances there. And then how do we actually select the nutrients that are going on those paddocks? What is the priority around selecting the nutrients in order to make sure that we can match it to the right product? And so when we talk about matching those nutrients and getting that strategy of nutrient resupply underway, what we're looking, particularly when we're talking about a multi-nutrient requirement, we want to, number one, set the nitrogen rate. So that's the thing that we will always try to get number one as a primary driver to get the product selection. The second thing is, do we need capital or P or K in the system? So if we need capital P or K in the system, that's the next consideration to selecting a product. And then the third consideration is the supplementation of P and K, and is that going to meet some or all of your fodder reserves in the system? So they're the 3 points, I suppose, in order that we would make our decisions around what product we would use. Okay, so nitrogen is our primary driver, as we said, and we want to be applying rates of a minimum of 25 kilos of nitrogen in every application, up to a maximum of 60 kilos of nitrogen in any one application. And typically we see a linear response to nitrogen. So the more we put on, the more dry matter we're going to get. But you can see the efficiencies drop off with higher rates. So we want to sort of cap it out at about that 60. I have got 80 kilos of nitrogen there in in brackets, and I think there are opportunities to push nitrogen really hard in certain situations, and that may be where you've taken a silage cut off, so you removed all that nutrient, all that nitrogen, and you need to put more nitrogen back in, and you're going for another cut of silage or another hay cut. Then I think, potentially you could apply up to 80 kilos at N in that situation. And this trial that we did in the Western District sort of shows that we maximised our response in nitrogen in this annual ryegrass trial at 90 kilos of N. So this was over 3 tonne of dry matter and rates, daily dry matter accumulation rates of about over 100 kilos at that top rate of 90. But yeah, I suppose we're getting responses, linear responses up to that point. And it's interesting just to see, just with nitrogen, why we need to be looking at those rates and why we got this maximum dry matter response. And it's well known in literature that to maximise this dry matter response, we need 3.5% nitrogen in the leaf of the ryegrass plant. So 3.5% nitrogen is above what the animal's protein requirements are going to be, because if you look down on this table here, when we're getting that 3.5% nitrogen at that 90 kilos of N applied rate, we're getting 24% protein, crude protein in the diet, which is probably 8% above what the animal's requirements are. Generally, we generally talk about 16-17% crude protein requirement in a diet. So you're going to be having a higher protein diet than what the animal requires, but this potential is only going to be part of what that diet is going to comprise of down the track. So interestingly, when we look at this nitrogen trial, you can see the increased nitrogen rate, the kilograms of nitrogen or dry matter that we've produced for every kilogram of N. So you can see them dropping back, and that's just an efficiency point where the more you put on, the less efficient it tends to be. But you can see what's happened with the energy. We've got really good energy levels over that 10.5 ME, which is really important, and that's that quality piece that we talk about. But even at 120, where we're starting to see that drop off of dry matter, you can start to see that shading and the yellowing and the higher and the more pseudo stem that's being produced. And that's why at those sort of levels, we start to see a little bit more of the energy dropping back, but also the NDF increasing when we start to get more stem occurring. So it rapidly changes, and so we need to be quite fluid, I suppose, in making sure that we're retaining quality in the pastures at this time of year. So the other considerations around nitrogen, if we're on a 20-day rotation, so we're really flying with our daily dry matter accumulation, we want to pull our nitrogen rates back, and this is the only time that we would be advocating rates of nitrogen of 20 to 25 kilos of N per hectare if you're on that 20-day or shorter rotation. The other considerations around nitrogen applications are we need adequate moisture. So this goes to the first slide where we were talking about the seasonal outlook, and potentially it's going to be above median rainfall. A lot of areas haven't seen that yet. Yes, we might be ticking along okay, but we're not seeing drains run and we're not seeing dams fill. So we're on the cusps of some moisture in the soil, but we're not really stacking a lot of moisture away. So we've just got to make sure that while we've got that soil moisture there and the grass is growing, that we need to extend that growth by using nitrogen in the system. If things dry out in the next month, it's too late to try and put nitrogen on in that situation. So we need moisture, and while we've got moisture, we need to be really driving that nitrogen. So being on the front foot and growing grass while we can is really important. Immediately cut. So we want to be applying nitrogen as soon as we cut or graze that pasture. So every day we delay the nitrogen application, we will be reducing the nitrogen response by 1%. So you delay that response of N getting into the system by 7 days, you're going to reduce the N response by 7%. And we need to understand the differences in growth habits of different species and cultivars. So while a species might be absolutely flying, or a cultivar might be absolutely flying now in early spring, Give it another month, it could have gone reproductive, and also we're going to be doing is growing a lot of root. So understand where you're putting nitrogen and nutrients into the system and what the end result is going to be as far as quality as well. We need a really good base of fertility. If we haven't got that base of fertility, we're not going to get the nitrogen responses. We want to be grazing or cutting, or grazing our management in particular, at canopy closure. So as soon as you start getting that canopy closure, which is going to be before 3-leaf or 4-leaf stage now with phalaris, but 3-leaf with ryegrass, it's probably going to be 2.5 leaf. As soon as you start getting that canopy closure, you're going to be getting yellowing down the base of the stem, and your stem's going to be extending, so you're going to get a lot more lignin being produced. Your dry matter is going to increase, but the digestibility is going to decrease, and NDF is going to increase, and the energy is going to decrease. So really being on top of that grazing management is really important. And being proactive. So once that starts to get out of control, or before it gets out of control on the rotation, you can't keep up with that grass, drop those paddocks early rather than waiting. Capture that quality. If we're cutting it for silage, we want to allow at least 3, if not 4 weeks from applying nitrogen to cutting. And that's got a lot to do with just the buffering capacity of the silage that you're cutting. It's going to take extra wilting time, potentially some tedding, to actually get it in the right condition to ensile. So you need that 4-week period to between the two, application and the cut. We need at least 10 mil of rainfall to get the urea, to get the nitrogen into the system. And the other point is that just remember that urea is volatile. There's been enough work. There's been a lot of work around from Graham Swenke, Richard Eckhart, Helen Suter, to suggest that losses are in that 20 to 30% of the applied nitrogen rate. So it's quite significant if you can't get that rainfall to move that nitrogen in. So it is volatile, be aware of it. And I guess, from just understanding that a little bit more, when we apply urea to the soil, that urea gets acted on by the urease enzyme, and that's a naturally occurring enzyme in the soil. And that happens quite quickly within a matter of days. So, and that the enzyme is a catalyst for this hydrolysis process. So as soon as you've got moisture, you've got this enzyme, this process starts, and the urea can go into an ammonium carbonate, and that ammonium carbonate is quite volatile, and it can go off as ammonia gas. And as I said, some of those losses can be as high as 30% if you've got extended periods of time with no rain and that urea sitting on the surface. So ammonia loss is quite significant, and it's real. And it's even more of an issue in pasture systems and cropping systems, because we have this thick, poorly buffered thatch that sits there, and as the urea granule sits on that thatch that is poorly buffered, it sits in the alkaline zone of pH for longer. So the urea granule has a pH of 9.5, and because it's really alkaline for longer and it's not sitting on the soil surface and buffering back as quick, it's prone to greater losses over a period of time. Particularly if you've taken silage off as well, where you've got that wind, you've got no cover, the wind on that urea that's been applied will be driven off and cause greater losses as well. So, and urease activity in pasture systems tends to be greater as well, because you've got more carbon, organic carbon system in the system as well. And there's a number of other factors that drive it. So wind and temperatures increasing in spring will see these losses increase. So we need that rain. You can protect those losses, and those losses can be protected by 70-80% by using a product called green urea, and at roughly $50-$55 a tonne extra on the urea, it's pretty good insurance to manage that nitrogen loss. And this is just some work from some different areas in southern Australia on looking at some of those losses were last year that we measured. So this is at Lardner in Gippsland, Coleraine, Tongala in northern Victoria, so that's the Western District, northern Victoria, and then at Tassie side in early summer. And so what we saw is losses of about 10% in the Western District in Victoria, and in Gippsland in Victoria, up to 16% in the spring application at Tongala. and up to 37%. 37% of the applied urea in Tasmania at Hagley. And where we use green urea, those losses were reduced by around 70 to 80%. So quite significant reduction and quite significant losses that are occurring over that. And this was measured over a 2-week period. So something to consider. And so you can get urea that is protected. But if you're looking at one of these boosters that we use urea in, you can get the protection to that urea in those boosters as well. Okay, so on to phosphorus. So hopefully that sets out the nitrogen strategy. With the phosphorus, this is a phosphorus pool. So only a very small amount of the phosphorus that sits in the phosphorus pool is in this available soil solution area. Most of it sits in this non-labile recalcitrant forms of phosphorus, some in this labile form, which cycles in and out of this solution P. But this solution phosphorus is really the only source of phosphorus that the plants can access. And they access it as orthophosphates, and that's the form of water-soluble P that we put in with single super, MAP, and DAP. And so the concentration of this soil solution it really is controlled by these complex soil interactions moving to and fro into the labile and non-labile fractions within the soil. But I suppose the point around phosphorus and phosphorus in any pasture systems is that only 10 to up to 40% of the applied P in the year of application is taken up by that pasture. So most of the phosphorus that is applied to plants actually comes from the soil, from these interactions and from this soil solution. It's really important to keep P topped up so that it moves into these different fractions and gets supplied back into the soil. But most of the P that is actually taken up by the plant in any one year is taken up through the soil supply rather than from the fertiliser supply. So that throws a little bit of a spanner in the works around the thinking around, well, do we need to put phosphorus into the system in spring in particular, or should we just wait and put it all in the autumn? So I guess there's a couple of, I've just put some cases for and cases against. So the cases for putting it out in the spring would be that, yes, from the work that Tim McLaren has done, shows that there's both readily and slowly available plant available. Inorganic P pools increase with the addition of P fertiliser. So we're getting more phosphorus going into the system that is becoming available in the inorganic pools. So it definitely does increase. So there is a case to put phosphorus in that situation. Fertiliser P does not become immediately unavailable, so it actually sits there for a reasonable amount of time. So you don't get it going into organic forms or recalcitrant forms in immediately. It does sit there for quite extended periods of time, and during the growing season, most of the fertiliser P remains in inorganic phosphorus, so that goes to that point, and later it's converted to organic P, so in the longer term. So while we're in the growing season and you apply P, it will be available for plant uptake. And the other consideration is that if we're looking at fodder conservation, we're removing more P from the system than what we would be under a grazing system. The cases against, or maybe why you might not think about it, is that slowly plant available inorganic P pools are a major sink. So we do put a lot of P into the system, and a lot of that goes into the sink of aluminium and iron phosphates over time. Adding fertiliser P above optimal levels for pasture growth only increase soil inorganic P, and particularly the slowly available pools. So a lot of it does, when you're putting it above the optimal P rates, you're setting more in the unavailable pools, the organic pools. Humus is the main organic phosphorus form that accumulates in the system, and that needs to be mineralised over time for that phosphorus to come back into the system, which is fine, and that's what pasture systems do. That's why we have high organic carbons. We're generally quite good. We're quite flush with our nutrient supply, so therefore we can accumulate more carbon in those systems. Most of the phosphorus resides in the top 10 centimetres. So to actually get recovery of that phosphorus, we need to maintain a good moisture status up there. So in the spring, typically we would expect that to be good because we're getting frequent rain fronts, it's staying moist. So the recovery of phosphorus is good. But if the soil dries out in that surface, then a lot of that applied P can be not available because the roots aren't active in that area. And as I said before, the soil is the largest source of P. So yeah, so that's one of the considerations, I suppose. If you're topping up a little bit, does it really matter? So when we get to the next point of it, to say, do we need to apply phosphorus or not? And it all comes down to where your critical ranges are. So if this is the better fertilisers decisions for pastures, and this is our critical ranges based on 95 to 98% on a dairy type system. If we're in a beef sheep type system, we would be operating on the lower part of the response curve. So these sort of numbers would be more reflective of what a beef sheep type system potentially would be. It doesn't matter. Individuals can operate anywhere on that response curve they like, and set whatever sort of yield targets they want to be getting. But the first thing is, are we operating in our critical range? And if we are, well, if we're below the critical ranges, so we're down here, then we would strongly advise to get some phosphorus out in the spring, and particularly getting it out late winter, early spring. So the earlier you can get that phosphorus into the system and satisfy the plant's requirements earlier, then you shouldn't see the plant deficiencies occurring. And remember that the peak phosphorus demand comes in spring as well. So getting that phosphorus out there and having that phosphorus cycling and having that phosphorus available, particularly when you've got below critical range levels, it's really important. The P will cycle through. P will cycle through the system through and spring phosphorus applications can be part of that strategy. So it's not right or wrong to bleed a little bit of phosphorus into the system, but it can be part of the overall strategy of phosphorus, small amount in the spring and a larger part in the autumn. And we could also match just a little bit of that fodder removal as well. So we can put P into the system that match some of that P that is actually taken out the gate when we remove the hay or silage off the paddock. So spring applications can definitely be part and should be part in certain situations of that strategy. Where you probably wouldn't look at phosphorus as part of your strategy in the spring would be where you've got very high soil P levels, and we want to be mining some of that phosphorus back out of the system. Or if we're just in the grazing system and our levels are in the optimal range, then we can probably just look at that application in the spring to keep our phosphorus levels okay. From a potassium point of view, it becomes a little bit more complicated. K has some soil mobility. When we apply muriate of potash to the soil, it is a salt, so it has some soil mobility. So when you broadcast it on the surface, you need soil surface moisture or a rainfall event to move that potassium into the soil. How much rainfall and how wet that soil needs to be will be very much soil dependent. So heavier soils, the K won't move very far. Lighter soils, you'll see it move into the soil profile a little bit more. The thing to remember with potassium is that most of it, the K is taken up by the plants through diffusion. So that's moving from an area of higher concentration to an area around the root of a lower concentration. And that diffusion, that rate of diffusion, is really dependent on soil moisture and soil temperature. So when you've got warmer soils with moisture, then you'll get a high rate of diffusion, soil supply of that potassium. When it's cold, then you'll see less diffusion and less mobility of that potassium into the root system. Some K is also taken up with mass flow. So as the plants take up moisture, some K in solution will be taken up through mass flow. The thing that we just need to consider with potassium is it's not like phosphorus in that it's required by the plant in much larger amounts. So typically we see leaf tissue K levels in the range of 2.5 to 3%. So if our spring dry matter production growth rates are 100 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day, the demand is going to be somewhere from the soil to supply to the plant uptake is going to be somewhere around that 2.5 to 3 kilos of potassium per hectare per day. So the question then is, can the soil supply enough K, give up enough potassium from the system to supply that? And part of that is going to be the relationship on root density and K uptake. So where you've got greater root density, you're going in the soil, you're going to get greater K uptake. So it depends on where the roots are and what the crop type is as to whether you're going to get enough K uptake from that component of the soil where the roots are active in. For example, if you're looking at say ryegrass, that it's a fibrous root system, probably only 42% of the total K would be sourced from the subsoil. So, less than half, 40% of it would be sourced deeper in the profile, less than 30 centimetres. The majority of it, because of the root system and the root structure, is going to be removed from the top 30 centimetres of the soil. So where K resides within the profile, and also the plant root morphology are going to dictate uptake. So with potassium, there's a lot of K in the soil, but only a small amount, probably only about 10% of the total amount of potassium, that sits in the soil is in this available pool. We've got a lot of structural K that sits there and fixed K, so this sits in the clay lattices, so this is structural, and you get this fixation and release between exchangeable potassium and the fixed K. So when you apply potassium to the soil, we're trying to supply into this soluble and exchangeable forms, but some of it will end up being fixed over time as well. The rate that this potassium is released from these exchange sites will all be about this diffusion, and this diffusion will be dependent on temperature and moisture. So the diffusion from the clay, the exchange sites of the potassium given up, will be all about the rate of diffusion and the rate of uptake. The soil will always try to reach an equilibrium. So once the plant removes that K from the system, the soil will always try to replace it. And while you've got adequate levels of potassium in the soil and adequate reserves, it can meet those generally. It can meet those requirements of the plant. Where the issue lies is if you start to get below your critical values, and you have this huge demand, then the supply of potassium from the soil becomes limited, and that's when you start to see K responses from plants. So when we look at K applications in the system, and we look at, say, broadcast application of muriate of potash. So, just going backwards. Then it depends on how, there's a number of things that depend on K supply to the system. And this just looks at soil texture, so soil type. So the 250 kilos of muriate of potash broadcast and incorporated. This is in a 12-month period, and we're looking at depths going down the y-axis, and we're looking on the x-axis of increasing exchangeable potassium levels. And this site received 750 to 950 mil of rain over a 12-month period. And then where you've got a single star, there's a significance in the difference, and it's highly significant with 2 stars. But there's 3 soil textures. So there's a light soil texture, which is the blue. There's a medium soil texture, which has a CEC of 11. It's in green. And then you've got this higher CEC of 56, or 60 CEC, which is in the grey. And what it shows, I suppose, when you've got these heavier soils, these higher soils, putting on potassium at those rates, you're getting a large lift in the surface level of potassium, but it's not going down the profile at all. Whereas when you're putting it on a lighter soil, so the bluer one, you're getting that influence of potassium much deeper down in the profile. So it is moving deeper into the profile over that period of time when you're either irrigating or you're in a high rainfall zone. When you're on a loam soil, that the influence probably gets checked to about 15 centimetres. Highly significant difference in the top 5 to 10, but only significance to 15 and then nothing after that. So soil texture plays a really important role in our strategies around putting rates of potassium on and capital rates of potassium on, and it's worth noting. So from a potassium point of view, again, got our critical values. Do we sit in the critical values or not? If we're below our critical values, our strategies are going to be strongly advising to put spring K out. Again, particularly early in that late winter, early spring, get K into the system and make sure it's there to supply in that peak demand of the pasture. If we're in the optimal range in here, it could be a partial replacement in the spring and autumn. So we're removing potassium from the system. Let's match some or all of that fodder removal at that period of time. And if our root system has been compromised from the tough winter, late autumn break that we've had, maybe we need to think about, maybe keeping enough K in that surface area to make sure that we're getting enough supply of K because the root system has been compromised. So smaller amounts more often, a couple of applications might be warranted. If we're really high again, no spring applications, we want to mine it. Luxury uptake is talked about, and I talk about luxury uptake. It's based on literature that you read, but at the end of the day, I think it's very hard when you actually nail it down to see any significant luxury uptake, to be honest. So there are imbalances, no doubt about it, between potassium and magnesium, but I don't see big luxury uptake levels of K. So I don't see pastures going from 2-3% up to 4-5% potassium. So I'm not too sure on the luxury uptake, but it's a consideration. And if we're grazing, there's obviously lower K removal as well. From a sulfur perspective, if we've got our critical values again based on better ferts in decisions. If we're below our critical levels, we definitely need to get sulfur bleeding into the system. Most of the sulfur is going to come from mineralisation in the spring. Most of it's contained in the organic carbon in the soil, but we still need to get some sulfur in there. We need to get sulfur cycling through the system. So it needs to be introduced at some stage during the season and maybe several times. If we've applied sulfur in the autumn winter, then we can use Superfect or Gran Am. Then hopefully your levels have been lifted. We've got no leaching losses of sulfur. It is mobile, so it hasn't been really wet, so we've got no leaching losses. But remember that we've had poor mineralisation over the last summer and autumn. So when we get good, moist, warm conditions this spring, we could get a little bit of a kicker of additional sulfur and nitrogen and phosphorus coming through increased mineralisation rates of those nutrients. If we're in the optimal range, maintenance spring or autumn applications, that's all you really need. Just you can tick along, but maybe just throw a little bit of sulfur in there to satisfy maintenance. But our overall strategy is we want to be including, once we're in the optimal range, at least 12 kilos of sulfur per hectare per year. If our soils are really high in S, so they're greater than 20, there's no need for spring applications. Majority of S will be supplied from mineralisation, and grazing removes not much sulfur from the system. So to pull all that together, we've spoken about the 4 key nutrients there, and there's a range of different boosters, green top blends that are available to satisfy the different requirements based on, number one, when we work out our hierarchy of product selection, we're working on number one, nitrogen. So we're setting our nitrogen rate between that 25 and 60. We're then going to look at our critical values. Do we need that capital boost or not with P and K? And if we do, we'd go with a higher P and K type product. And then we look at what we're pulling off that paddock as far as removal. So, and then work out a strategy. Is it partial or full replacement of that nutrient? And that will come up with the suitable product that then matches the product hierarchy decision tree. Just to finish off, the last couple of slides, just around quality. And I mentioned this at the start, and this is what my good friend Frank Mickham talks about a lot. And you can see just the pasture here on the right. Yes, there's a heap of tons there, but when you and I call it top and tail. So when you can see the top and you start to see heads emerge, you're operating down here in this later growth stage of the plant where you're getting more stem, less vegetative growth, your quality is really dropping off as far as energy, your dry digestibility is really dropping off, and your energy levels are really dropping off. So if you're operating down here and you're cutting this type of material, then you're going to be getting very poor quality material. So the top is when we're getting reproductive, and when I say the tail, I'm looking inside the crop and seeing yellowing, I'm seeing stem extension, and I'm seeing a drop in quality quite significantly. So I guess if we're starting to see that the paddocks are getting out of control from a grazing perspective, let's drop them out early, keep on front of it, in front of that, in front of the quality. Because if you wait a little bit longer, then all of a sudden you get a rain, or the contractor is delayed for a week or two, then your good quality all of a sudden turns into very poor quality. So be on the front foot is what I'd be saying. And the other thing with it is, once we see this lodging and this yellowing, not only is it poor quality, but you also get a slower regrowth, because you're getting aerial tillering, you're getting bare ground, gaps in the sward, and so yeah, the regrowth will be a lot slower as well, rather than if you had to cut it a little bit earlier and got this quality material. So I guess the message there is 2x4 cuts are much better than 1x8 cut from a hay and silage production. So just to wrap that up, so plan and implement a robust soil and tissue sampling program this spring, and that'll set us up for the immediate term, but also look forward into that, so the short term, but also into that autumn period of time and next season as well. Follow that sound process to determine the nutrient requirements, logically work through what we're trying to do, and enact that hierarchical decision making to come up with how you're going to formulate that fertiliser plan. Be proactive during the growing season. So if you need to drop paddocks out, drop them out, but be on the front foot. When you've got moisture, get on the front foot and get that fertiliser out there to grow the grass while you've still got that moisture. So organise the fertiliser, and yeah, good luck with getting it, pulling it all together, I guess. So that's pretty much it, Jan, from a presentation point of view.
Thanks, Lee, very much for that presentation. I have added, I'm hoping you can all see the chat. I've added a link in there to some further information to our Incitec Pivot Agronomic Insights website, and there is a write-up of this talk on that page. And I'll now open it up for questions if anyone has any, if they can just type them into the chat or the Q&A, whichever one you can see, and I'll relay them to Lee. And Lee, just while everyone's thinking, you've mentioned the need to test both soil and tissue. Is there a particular test suite at NA that you prefer to use, or does it not really matter?
I think with your plant tissue, you want to get the basic plus molly. You want to include molly. That's obviously one of the micros that we're definitely seeing rear its head, I suppose, from a deficiency point of view in samples coming through. So yeah, so the basic, I think it's I don't know, I can't remember the actual code, Jan, but just make sure it's with molly, so your basic nutrients plus molly. For the soil test, look, I think you want to be getting, so you want to be drawing the picture in the shorter term and more frequently around phosphorus and potassium. So I think, you know, it depends on how your strategy on sampling goes. If you're doing a zonal approach and you're doing a monitoring approach, then, you know, you might get a full comprehensive soil test once every 5 to 7 years, but every 2 to 3 years you might be testing more for maybe exchangeable cations and phosphorus, just to pick up the P and K in particular, because things like, you know, liming and ameliorants, you're probably looking at a little bit, your horizons, once you've started to address those problems, just go a little bit further out. So sampling a little bit longer with those, but coming in with a cheaper suite that had be cheaper because it's got less analytes on it, but particularly monitoring things like phosphorus and potassium on a more frequent basis is pretty important, I would think. So, yeah.
Okay. We have one from Isaac Riley. Has there been any data or work done on applying low rates of sulphur with nitrogen to help the nitrogen uptake, assimilation and efficiency?
So not that I'm aware of. I'm sure there is some work out there. Obviously, to build proteins, there needs to be a certain amount of sulfur in conjunction with phosphorus, and I think the ratio is something like 12:1. So if you haven't got adequate sulfur, then you're not going to build proteins when they're the building blocks, I suppose, of plant growth or plant material. So you need them in the right ratios, and so that's the importance, I suppose, of keeping sulfur bled into the system consistently, and making sure that we're not missing it. But again, a lot of the sulfur resides, 90% of it will reside in the organic material, but you need that material to mineralise to supply that sulfur from that form. But you need sulfur, because sulfur's been removed, it's not a closed system, you need to keep sulfur going into the system to, number one, satisfy the plant requirements directly, but secondly, to satisfy any carbon or the carbon, the mineralisation process as well, replenish those carbon supplies once it mineralises. So I don't know whether that answers the question.
Thank you. A very helpful answer was the response. Are there any more questions that anyone has? We'll give them a second to think, Lee.
That's okay.
Doesn't look like there is.
That's okay.
So with that, Lee, thank you very much for your presentation this morning. Thank you to everyone who has attended. There is a little bit more information on our website, and I'm sure Lee would be, and any of our other agronomists would be very willing to answer any questions that you have. If you haven't enrolled in agronomy and practice training for next year, please make an inquiry, because you'll get a lot more information around all of the nutrients like this and how to apply them. So again, thank you very much. Happy Friday, everyone, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks all.